Hello, welcome. Welcome. As people are starting to file in, go ahead and drop in the chat where you are tuning in from if you would like. I'd love to see where everyone is coming from this evening. And thank you for joining us. Just going to give it another moment or two while people are trickling in, and then we'll get started in just a minute here. Michelle is coming from Snohomish, Washington. Catherine's coming from Boston. Welcome. Wonderful. Houston. Hi, Rita. Welcome. Ooh, got a bunch more locations. Let's see. Grand Rapids, Linwood, Bothell. Wonderful. Langley, Washington. Beautiful. Okay, it looks like it's kind of tapering off. Oh, hi from Queen Anne. Hi, Rosemary. So we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are here to discuss Masa. Oh, my green screen doesn't like it. We're here to discuss Jorge Gaviria's new book, Masa, which we're very excited about. I'm Zoe Friesen. I'm the events manager here at Booklarder. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. The Booklarder is a community cookbook store here in Seattle, Washington. We sell 100% cookbooks and food writing. It is a wonderful place. I hope you have a chance to join us soon in person. Yes, and so we've been, of course, having more virtual events over the last couple of years. We're starting to have some more in-person events now, but it's wonderful to still be able to also have virtual events like this so we can connect with authors that are all over and interviewers that are all over, and of course, viewers that are all over as well. So we love doing these virtual events and we will certainly continue them on. This talk will be posted on YouTube tomorrow, so or probably either tomorrow or the next day. So if you want to share it with a friend, you can send them the link, or if you have to jump off early, you can always log on and catch the tail end and all that. I've got just a couple more notes before we get into it. I have the live transcript turned on. If you wanted to turn that on or turn that off, there is a note, there's a button for that under live transcript. At the bottom of your Zoom screen there, so you can go ahead and do that. Thank you so much for everyone who has already purchased a copy of Masa from Booklarder, and I will also drop a link in the chat if you would like to get your copy from us. You know, these events are free, but you can support them by purchasing a book from our shop. So without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. We are so happy to welcome Jorge Gaviria and Lesley Tellez.
Hello.
Thanks so much, Zoe.
Thank you, Zoe. Hi, Jorge. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing good.
Good to see you.
Yes, likewise. I'm so excited to be here and to be talking about this just absolutely stunningly gorgeous book that you've created, and I really mean that. I'm not being hyperbolic. It's really beautiful. And we know each other. We're friends, so I wanted to just kind of keep this, you know, kind of fun and informal and
yeah.
Yeah.
You actually had a very big hand in helping get this book to where it is, because you were instrumental in editing and kind of putting the pieces together for Nixtamal, the primer, the kind of like self-published booklet that we did a few years ago.
Yeah.
And had we not done that, I don't think we would have had like any proof of concept or frankly, the confidence to get a book like this out in the world. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh gosh, thank you. No, it was really fun to work on that project. Which is that still for sale on your website? No.
Not anymore. It got an upgrade.
Yeah.
It's the sequel is out now. It's called Masa.
Yeah. Gosh, well, I guess that's my first question is maybe you can talk a little bit about, you know, I'm not sure how much folks on the call know about you, but you founded a company called Masienda, which is basically kind of the leading company right now, like selling corn heirloom. Can I call it heirloom? I still feel weird using the word heirloom around here.
Totally.
Okay. Heirloom Mexican corn for use in tortillas, you know, to make masa at home.
Mm-hmm.
And you sell, Masienda sells tortilla presses and like other really great kitchen items to like help home cooks, you know, be inspired on their masa journey and be able to make this tortilla at the end of the day. So yeah, I guess I just wanted you to hear a little bit about like why now, you know, why was now an important time for you to get a cookbook out in the world? You're obviously super busy doing a lot of other stuff. So why was this important to you?
Yeah, I, you know, starting this journey 9 years ago and wanting to launch a company that really focused on masa kind of as like the primary, I don't know, the primary like motor of all things that we do. You know, there wasn't much out there. Like when I started doing my own research on kind of what the process looks like to make masa, you know, I started out sourcing heirloom corn from smallholder farmers in Mexico, working with them to kind of create an impact-based supply chain and connect that to chefs across the world, with some pretty notable chefs, you know, at that. And I think in the early days, it was really humbling to see some of my heroes like totally flummoxed by this process. Like they were like, we just have no idea what we're doing. You know, like where do you go? No one's written a book on this. No one's really, you know, we didn't spend time learning from our grandmothers this process. It's a very oral tradition. And there's a lot of kind of technical sort of nature to it if you want to go down that route, that I think chefs were very curious about, but didn't have the information to really confidently approach it. So my job early on, just to be able to make the supply chain work and create a sustainable business model for the farmers we represent and the communities that we serve, you know, the education was really critical to that. So I started to kind of piece together all of these data points of chefs that were trying things out, and I would take notes. And then at some point I realized like, man, this is actually really starting to kind of to get some meat on it. You know, there's a lot here. And then, you know, around 2017, it was like about 3 years after I started Masienda, we did this little, you know, booklet called Nixtamal, which I was like, all right, let's have it out there. It was sort of like the best of the frequently asked questions we got at Masienda from both home cooks and professional chefs. And I found that actually, one, there was a big demand for it. It kind of just, we kept printing them. And we're just like, man, this is pretty amazing. And two, chefs weren't satisfied. They wanted more. You know, there were still so many questions. So honestly, it took a couple of years to kind of sit with it, understand what that opportunity was. And then I think I was very intimidated by it. So I decided, you know, just to kind of start putting pen to paper, understand kind of like what I knew. And the more I started writing, the more it came out. And at some point we had the makings of a book that I just felt, you know, was too good of a moment to pass up.
Yeah. It's funny because when you mention having collected all of those data points, you know, I remember, like, I know clearly what it's like to be in front of the nixtamal. You know, you've cooked your corn, you have an idea that you're going to make a corn tortilla, and you start with, it's a whole process. You start with nixtamalizing your corn. How much caldo you use, I don't know. I think, well, I went to cooking school in Mexico City. They told me this much.
Right.
But wait, I cooked it. I was lucky enough to have a grinder. I ground it. But it didn't puff, and what did I do wrong? And, you know, and you were like one of the few people I remember feeling like I could ask, and I didn't want to bug you, but you were one of the few people I felt like I could ask to be like, what did I do? And not only that, like you would have a ratio, you know, like, well, if you do, you know, whatever percent this to like, you know, this percentage of that, or, you know, try this. And I remember feeling like that was just so amazing. It was such important information because, like you said, you know, this has been an art that for so long has just been passed down orally, and nobody has really attempted to or gathered this kind of information.
Yeah, I mean, you were teaching a class, I remember, in Brooklyn, right, on this subject. And I think that's how we first connected. I was just like, I was so curious how you could do that, you know, and like how, you know, it was a pretty amazing thing to be able to carry that tradition on in the way it was sort of like how it's been done for centuries, for millennia. And I was like, man, this is cool, but we gotta work together to get as much information out there as we can, because there are just so many questions, you know?
Yeah. So why did you choose to structure the book the way it is? Because I feel like, there's at the beginning, there's this, really sciencey, kind of heavy sciencey part. And in the middle, there's a lot of history. And I was reading through it and thinking like, this is almost kind of like a very cool nonfiction book about Masa that's in a cookbook's clothing,
Right, right.
So, why was it important to you to structure it that way?
Yeah, I think part of it was the proposal that I put, that we sort of shopped around to different publishers. The recipes were very important to them. Understandably, it's a cookbook first and foremost. But I think that given, just like doing basic, brand surveys and things like that, we were asking just all people in our network, families, in-laws, like, do you know what masa is? Most people did not know, which is crazy because we eat it all the time. I think everybody we surveyed once we asked them a follow-up question, do you eat a taco? Do you eat a tamal? Do you eat, arepas? Have you ever had one? When was the last time you had one? It was like 2 hours ago. Everybody could relate to this food, and yet nobody really could identify it. And it just kind of struck me that it was an opportunity to consolidate all of these sources of information that I've been working with over the years into one easy place and one easy reference. Because I think that the context is so important to kind of set up that experience that you ultimately have. Once you know how much goes into doing something, and truly like how unbelievable the history is of this, like it's kind of hard to not really appreciate it and take a deeper dive and closer look. So I think it sort of felt organic. Our publisher was really curious about it themselves and curious how we could kind of, I think, approach it from a non-threatening, like very easy sort of a really accessible point of view. And I think that we pulled it off, but you'll just have to buy the book and find out.
Yeah, I feel like it manages definitely to be something that, for me as somebody who's been, nixtamalizing her own corn for a while now, like I would call myself a masa nerd. Like I'm in the club, and yet the book is like that deep dive that I want, like I want to know, yes, tell me about a pH meter. Okay. I'm going to buy that. And I saw the line about the laser thermometer, and I'm going to buy that too. So like, wow, I can buy a thermometer to see how hot my comal is. Like,
right.
Holy cow. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I feel like there are these things for those of us that really do, we want to go there all the way. And, but at the same time, for somebody who's just starting out, it has the information that they would need too. So,
and the photos, it was important that like there was a very strategic, borderline manipulative to make sure that we were able to reach everybody, and make this a book for everybody. Because like there were questions I knew chefs were going to have questions about, or had questions that chefs were going to want answers for. And if we didn't include that, we wouldn't be serving a really important part of our community. If we weren't obviously fostering kind of this curiosity and meeting home cooks, whatever level, they're at, in terms of like proficiency and experience, that would be a missed opportunity. So the photos really bring it, I think, home. Kind of medicine was in the ice cream, or the masa.
Yeah, they're beautiful. So how did you go about choosing the recipes? Because obviously there's so many things made with masa, and how did you narrow it down to this specific group?
Yeah, it was so easy. No, it wasn't. It wrote itself, and yet it didn't write itself. One, it was 2020, it was the pandemic, so there wasn't a heck of a lot going on. Everybody else was at home too. We were all doing the same things. But I felt uncomfortable. So I worked in kitchens in New York, and worked for Danny Meyer at a restaurant called restaurant called Mylino. Then I worked at Blue Hill at Stone Barns in the front of house, and then did a little bit back of house apprenticing, and had experience working in kitchens. And I think I realized very quickly while I was working at kitchens that my end goal was not to become a chef. I did not want to be, I'm really great at like creatively, I've got the fundamentals. I was promoted or invited to be promoted to be a chef. And I was like, I just don't want to write recipes. Like, it's just not I'd rather just kind of free flow and have a good time. I felt like I developed a strong sense of self-sufficiency. But when it came to writing this book, I was like, oh man, what am I going to do here? Like, I have to come up with 50 recipes, or at least that's what they're saying I have to do for this contract. And I just basically started to document. To me, the first step was to like, what do I know? What is the real recipe that I can contribute that doesn't exist out there? And that was, of course, like this kernel to masa recipe, which has like a very long form, kind of like tartine country loaf recipe of like 40 pages. Don't worry if you don't want to read that whole, chapter. It's there if you want it. It's you can just ignore it if it's not something you want to read. But then I condense that for kind of more, I think, like easy reading and following if you just needed a quick note to pick up here or there. And those were mine. I felt like those were a contribution of my experiences and translated all of these data points that I collected over the years to really just drive something home with like precision. And I think from there, I was like, all right, well, what are you going to do with this? Interestingly, I think if you look at the canon of Masa inspired cookbooks, you get Mexican cookbooks that have some Masa recipes in them, Masa applications like a tamal or very specific, but no one had ever really taken the time to, I think, connect the dots of how often and how much Masa appears across Latin America, not just in Mexico. So I started to just kind of like document what those shapes were. There's a book I love. It's like the pasta geometry book. It's like all of these different pasta shapes. I think it's like 300. And I was like, man, Masa's got its own little shape dictionary going on. Why don't we just kind of start to piece together what that looks like? And then visually, I was like, man, this would be really cool photographically to kind of just have this guide. And then I was basically just, by the time it was done, I was, referencing the history of each of these shapes in very, very easy bite-sized form, like it's a page. Of course, the preparation for it using the masa that you've just now made, or masa harina that you just prepared. And then I realized we had 28 shapes that really they really nailed it in terms of like capturing the canon that exists out there. It became like this photographic encyclopedia that you can actually cook through, and which felt really more, I think, original to me. I feel like more of a reporter than a chef in that sense. And so those shapes are really meant to, you can kind of approach that with whatever condiments you have in your fridge. If you've got a sope and now you know how to make a sope, you can make leftovers taste like very fresh and new with any one of these shapes. And then, approach your favorite cookbooks, whether they're Mexican, Guatemalan, any culture that represents masa in some way, have those cookbooks now, with this masa kind of reinforced knowledge in mind. So that was the shapes section. So you've got like this foundational sort of masa, how to make masa, then the masa shapes, which is really kind of a journey through all of the shapes and forms it can take. And then these modern masa recipes, which was really fun. It's was a continuation of that primer that we worked on together, that booklet. Just seeing some of the cooler recipes that we've kind of come across over the years, ones that kind of made us think a little bit, and kind of just be like, man, I didn't really even think that masa could show up in a waffle, and taste really good. Folks that kind of have inspired us throughout the years. And, that was how that chapter was written. Everything from masa sourdough to masa gnocchi to, a waffle and a cookie, which has been a really fun thing to also just kind of chart. And there's so many more. Book number 2 is already writing itself.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about as you were talking was like, the title of the book is Techniques, Recipes, and Reflections. And I feel like what we see so often now with cookbooks is, and I am also like, I don't want to use the word guilty because it has a pejorative context, but we write this like personal thing in the cookbook, usually in the head note. And one thing that I was really struck with in your book is a lot of the recipes are fairly bare bones, they're as far as like the head notes, it gives you the info that you need to know. but you are in the other stuff, you know, like you're in the science and in the history and and then also in like you said, the very long you know, tartine
Girl
like
Masa chapter.
recipe
Yeah.
and the right. And so yeah, I don't know. I feel like that was just a comment that I had, I guess. But I did want to ask you on recipes. Was there one recipe or one section, even because so much of the book is not just recipes, that was close to your heart? Maybe that it could either be close to your heart, that maybe felt complicated to write, or that you struggled with. Just curious about that aspect of putting it together.
Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned a little bit that it was hard to sort of approach recipes in a way that felt like I was contributing something new. You know, I felt like the masa recipe was something that just, it was the deeper kind of dive that I had been personally craving. And I felt that that nailed it, but that's like one of, you know, 50-ish recipes. So the encyclopedia to me was like my way of calling it a recipe, fulfilling my contractual obligation, but also feeling like I was doing something new for kind of the education and like connecting all of these cultures through this food and staple. I think the other thing, just in general for the book itself, is that like I have a complicated cultural identity that I did not expect to show up, you know, as much as it did, you know, in the process of writing this book. You know, from the time that the book was brought on board with Chronicle, the editor was asking me like, "Where are you from?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm from Miami, and I grew up in a really Cuban community, but you know, my mom was actually technically born in Mexico. My dad was born in Cuba, and they lived all over Latin America." And you know, I kind of like equivocated because I hadn't really ever been put on the spot that way. I was like, "Well, it's just I'm sort of everywhere," and it had me really kind of think about like what my own connection with this food was from a very early age, you know, how I connected with it, why I'm allowed to write a book like this. And it was also in the height of 2020, which obviously it was a major cultural reckoning. And to me, it was like it was very complicated. Like I was a little intimidated by it. And that's why I included a note on culture kind of as a preface to the book, because I just wanted to just put out there, like, I know what I look like. I know that I am not a, you know, I'm not, I look like I can be, I look white, like at the end of the day, right? And I think that there's sort of there's an expectation for myself included, like what should you look like? What background should you have to be able to write a book like this? And I think the more I accepted who I am and kind of what my own journey has been and just put that out on paper, the more comfortable I felt sort of offering this as, you know, a reflection of a lot of voices that have informed this journey along the way.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that because I thought that was, I don't know, it felt very interesting and like personal to be reading it, and you touched on that like at the very beginning in the book, you know, within the first, I think it's within the first like 20 pages or something.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought that was, you know, pretty brave to get in, you know, to get into it. And it's at the end of the day, you're only answering to you, you know?
Yeah. It felt like
but
Eminem, you know, in 8 Mile when he's like, you know, he's about to go up for his last battle and he just basically like said everything. He anticipated what anyone was going to say. And like, there was nothing else to really say after that. I think it was just like, it was important to be self-reflective in the moment that we had arrived in.
Sure.
And like, also just, I think the biggest goal for me of the book is to connect cultures through food. It's not a Mexican cookbook, though Mexico very much informs the journey, right? It's not for any one culture. It's not to divide folks. It's not meant to say that the food you grew up eating wasn't correct or the food that you grew up eating, you know, was better than this one. It really is just there for anybody to kind of build on, you know, and I really, yeah, I mean that and still feel it.
Yeah. Well, I feel like too, there's such a, can feel really complicated because there is such a scarcity of cookbooks like this, you know, like this is the only one that like this that has really ever been published like in English and maybe in Spanish too.
It's
Uh,
coming.
okay.
Yeah.
So, so I do feel, yeah, you know, there's this mindset, I think, among people that because because we haven't seen our foods in a cookbook like this, because we haven't seen ourselves reflected, that if we're not in there, then it's wrong. You know, if it's not like my grandma made it, if it's not like, you know, my Tio or whoever, my tia made it, then it's wrong. But I definitely got a lot of feedback like that when I wrote my cookbook. You know, people were like,
Yeah.
you from other Latinos, you know, who were
Mhm.
like, you wrote this, whatever, you know, you wrote this, whatever recipe it was, you wrote it wrong. So yeah, no, I feel like, but I feel like it has more to do with scarcity, you know, publishing as it is, there's not that many Mexican cookbooks at the end of the day, you know, or
Yeah.
cookbooks, not that you just said yours wasn't a Mexican cookbook, but there's not that many
No, but
cookbooks that are
it
focusing on
can
these
be.
kinds of foods. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be if you want it to be. Like it's a, to me, it's a reflection of a staple that certainly it has a strong history and presence in Mexico, but is not limited to Mexico, you know?
Yeah. What else? What other? I had lots of questions I wanted to ask. Oh, I know what I was going to ask you. So, how did you? You know, one thing I've sort of struggled with, I think, when I've written recipes for masa, is that it's so hard to describe. Like, it's hard. It's like you just want them to be there with you, like so you can be like, you know, here's how you know when it's done. Like the eternal question, right? How do you know when it's done?
Right.
um, or just, you know, little things along the way. So I was curious kind of how you dealt with transforming what is like a very tactile, you
Mhm.
know, art into something on the page.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that was the like allure of the project to begin with, is that it has taken on so many elusive qualities from start to finish, you know, between, you know, like I think beginning with the supply chain in corn, you know, like I started Masienda in 2014, and even in Mexico, even though there's lots of documentation of the types of varieties that exist of corn, and you know, this is like there's a taxonomy with it. If you go to talk to a farmer, it's like this is blue corn, this is red corn, this is yellow corn, and we kind of have the same approach in the U.S. Like maybe with really large industry, it's like really specific. It's like this is Syngenta 265. It depends. Like there's a at a very basic level, everyone's like, this is yellow, this is blue. So I think the interesting thing was that even before the Masa journey itself started, there was like this curiosity about just like documenting and understanding what is what. It wasn't chance, you know. There were clear differences in the actual raw ingredient itself that are going to inform this whole journey. And like once I started to understand that, I'm like, all right, this isn't just a, you know, a blue or a red corn. This is like a really specific varietal that has a really specific purpose for recipe applications in this part of Mexico, you know, or this part of Guatemala or whatever it is. So I think like that kind of helped set up the basis for me of understanding masa in the same way, which is very elusive. It's like just cook it till it's sort of done, you know, and then like, you know, just rinse it a little bit. And the cool thing about Masienda and the experience that I've had is that I've worked with farmers, I've worked with their families, you know, in their kitchens, really have had an amazing opportunity to see kind of regional cooking across Mexico from a masa perspective. And then I've also worked with tortillerias in the United States and Mexico as well to understand how to do this at scale. And like, it was pretty cool to see, for example, El Milagro, which is one of the largest in the United States. You know, they do 6 billion tortillas a year using this traditional method of masa. They have like almost 200 recipes for a corn tortilla. And like, that's just 3 ingredients. You know, there's not a lot of you know, variation, to me at least in the beginning, that I could see. But you start to realize like these levers are actually quite simple. No one had just really kind of like mapped that out. No one thought there would be an interest in it. But once you understand what those variables are, and there's really just like a handful of them, you can really kind of manipulate those variables to adjust to whatever your version of delicious is. And I learned that in coffee. You know, like how many versions of coffee do we have out there in the world? You know, we've got cold brew, espresso, you know, drip coffee. You've got all sorts of instruments to do those types of coffee. At the end of the day, it's just extracting water out of coffee, like sort of brewing that experience. And Masa was the same thing. So I think just understanding like these very, very elemental sort of units, that we think about with regard to Masa, it was the way to kind of to map it in a way that it didn't say that one, I think at the end of the day, everybody was right. Like if you're asking what the perfect Masa is, you really, if all of these variables are being used, it's just depending on what emphasis you're putting on what along the way. And that was cool. I think it just like, it was kind of a duh moment. It's like, oh, this is all science. Like this isn't even the puff, the tortilla puff. This is pretty straightforward, guys. This is just like steam
Not magic.
building up. It's not magic. And also it doesn't mean you need to get married, like that's a very, gendered, story that we've kind of heard over the decades and centuries, but really it's just steam,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I liked how you described, I read the tlacoyo recipe, and I liked how you described like, poke at it, and if it feels sort of like you would a steak when you're cooking a steak, and if it has the same sort of, firmness, right? Then it's done. It's like, oh yeah, okay, I can see that. Like, yeah. And you were talking about rinsing, and there is a section on like a subhead, like a heading on rinsing in the book.
Yeah.
Could you talk just a little bit about that? Because I'm
for the
just about
real
rinsing.
core nerds. Just, I mean, like it's one of those steps that, you go through this. So let's just, for nixtamalization, what that is, sounds like it's a very complicated word. It's very simple. Just take some water, boil some corn, throw a powder in it, just like a little bit of powder, like basically a tablespoon-ish if you're doing like a pound, maybe a teaspoon. Don't quote me on that. Just use the measurements in the book. But like basically a dash of powder, some water, and corn. Cook it until it's like kind of al dente. That's all you're doing, and letting it soak for a couple hours. Once you do that, you have what's called nixtamal. And this is now corn that's been, it's kind of gone through this alchemy process where it's been imbued with nutrition through the calcium. The presence of calcium, that powder is calcium heavy. You've got the ability now to absorb all of the natural occurring amino acids in your body. Like corn is now no longer an empty calorie. It's a miracle, amazing. It's called nixtamal. And then you go to grind it. Before you go to grind it, you've got, there's the sort of like pulp kind of emerges in this process. And these are the skins of the corn. And the skins of the corn, because corn doesn't have gluten, you really need those skins if you're going to make masa to help bind your masa. Like it is it creates that elasticity that you want from a corn tortilla. If it's not in there, it's going to most likely break. And this is why most people say they like a wheat tortilla better than a corn tortilla, because they think that a corn tortilla is just that much more prone to breaking. Not if you include some skins in there. So yeah, the section on rinsing was just one of those like, this is sort of like this is one of those things you would just sort of take for granted. And there's a lot of also flavor from that calcium hydroxide that you sometimes want to kind of mitigate with a nice rinse. It's an important step, it like takes all of like maybe 30 seconds, but it was one of those things that if you miss it, you might get something that doesn't really kind of reflect what you had the intention of cooking in the first place. So it was just like little surprises like that to me along the way that had a huge impact on the final product that felt really important to include in that in-depth chapter. You can also just jump straight to the recipes and like start using masa harina, which is just add water and super easy too.
Yes. But yeah, unfortunately, that's not me. I'm the person who's I want to read about rinsing, and I was also like, oh my gosh, the section on the stones, like the volcanic rock, and I know we're sort of geeking out here, but like, dude, this is a book on masa. Let's geek out, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
But yeah, the section about stones I thought was so interesting. So so there's this, or can you talk about that? I won't even talk about it. You talk about the section on the grinding stones that you.
Yeah. So there's, if you do this process, I mean, you should just appreciate, even if you get masa harina, because it's been, all the hard work has been done for you. And one of the, in addition to rinsing, you gotta grind the corn down, the nixtamal down. And historically that was done on a metate. So just like the manual grinding surface, basically take a rod and drag it over and over and over again. It would take like hours, depending on how much masa you were doing. And then, yeah, with the advent, and that was always with a basalt stone most often. So basalt coming from volcanic rock. It's readily abundant across Mesoamerica. Mexico especially has a lot of volcanoes, as we know. And it's really great. It's a porous surface. It's really, it just creates a really beautiful texture of masa when it's done and applied on that surface. You know, with electrification of that process, you know, and these molinos, these electric mills that use basalt stones. What's really cool is that, you know, it took that technology and kind of kicked it up a notch. It had these very specific patterns you would cut into it. And I learned this actually when I went to El Milagro for the first time, and I asked to see their stones just to kind of like take a look at them. And he, one of the owners of the company was like, you know, this is like a family secret. Like, I cannot show you the stones. This is like our intellectual property here. It was their signature way of cutting the stones that like was this really crucial way for them to get the types of masa that they wanted. And then that kind of piqued my interest. And then I started asking other people, and they were like, yeah, we're not really going to show you. And some might show us, but at the end of the day, I realized like, man, this is such an amazing, like, this is such a, of course, like this had to kind of evolve in this way to where it was a really important piece of the puzzle. And there's actually a group out here in LA called Azteca Machines.
Yes, this was super interesting.
Yeah.
I read, yes, but go ahead.
It's a third generation family that literally all they do is just serves the basalt stones that are used across the United States. So like any tortilleria that does this traditionally still, which there are quite a few, they just carve stones. That's like, they have their quarry in Guadalajara. They bring stones out, and I walked through this giant shipping container of stones that they had kind of pre-cut. And they showed me just how all of the kind of the variations in volcanic rock, I mean, depending on how fast it cooled and how much sort of like gas was in it as it was sort of expanding and cooling, it informed and impacted the actual size of the little holes that you see in basalt. And that has a huge impact on like this grinding process, because the larger the pores are, the more the heat is diffused. The smaller they are, the less sort of efficient it is at mitigating that heat. And because those stones are turning on each other so fast, it generates a lot of heat, which can sometimes like burn your masa, which is not a good look or smell or taste. So yeah, it was just like, it was such an amazing eye-opening experience to think like, this is just something that a lot of restaurants even sort of glossed over. And at the end of the day, they were, you know, it's like, this was just as important as any other step in the process, the stones, you know, it's wild.
It's totally wild. And again, like you were saying, I feel like it just brings home that point about science, like really being the key thing in all of it, you know?
It explains everything, you know?
It's amazing. Yeah. So another thing I wanted you to talk about was, and this is in the book too, but going over the alternatives to cal. You know, it was really interesting to read about the cal viva, which I feel like I see so often in Mexico, and I hadn't really read like sort of an in-depth explanation about what it was. But yeah, I liked that you highlighted the fact that there's other alkalins that, you know, other alkaline solutions that you can use to nixtamalize that aren't cal. So yeah, I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, nixtamal itself comes from the Nahuatl word for ash, nextli, I think, nextli, and it was believed to be probably the first alkaline substance used. So alkaline being like on a pH scale, you have acidic, you have basic, you have neutral in the middle, alkaline being more basic. So highly caustic, you know, a lot of cleaning, you know, I'm trying to think of like, of course I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it's used in a lot of things, industrial applications too. And, you know, calcium hydroxide is what we commonly use today. It's, you know, derived from limestone. So very natural, like just you're taking limestone, you're calcifying the limestone through this like high heat process. And then you get this, you know, resulting, you know, basic substance, which is used in so much, like, you know, it's also actually a key ingredient in mortar, like cement, because it's a binding agent and actually has a binding property in masa as well, which is really cool. But, you know, ashes were typically used from all hardwoods, you know, that you could find throughout the Americas. And the flavor is pretty amazing actually when you do nixtamalize with ash. It's there's a cleaner way to do it, so you don't get this like sludgy, like burnt, gross ash pot, which I used to do in the beginning when I was first starting this process. There's a much sort of more efficient way to do it, but the flavor kind of gives you this like really beautiful campfire quality to it that's delicious. And if you've got some ash laying around, just make sure you let it cool before you do it. I made the mistake of not letting it cool before I picked it up at Julina restaurant, like very late at night one night, and it burned a hole through the carpet of my car, which is still there. I should have included that photo in the book, but it already gone to print. So yeah, that Azteca Machines is another one that's used, which I think I can't remember the exact like chemistry elements. It's like sodium. Is it sodium chloride? Sodium's in it, and it's basically it's
salt,
used
right?
actually it's basically salt, largely salt, and it's used to kind of actually as a flavoring agent in a lot of foods throughout Mexico, but it was also an early kind of alkaline substance, lower pH I think than ash and lye, but certainly like still something that was used to treat corn and break it down.
So have you ever kind of gone down the rabbit hole and, I don't know, started looking for some sort of unconventional maybe alkaline solutions to try to nixtamalize corn with?
That's the next book, I guess. I haven't, honestly. I kept it pretty straightforward because I have a roommate, my wife, and the science experiments, there is a limit to what I can do in our home. But I also think that, I just wanted to make sure I kind of understood what had been used, kind of played with those elements. And then I think the cool thing has been to see how folks see this and then kind of like one up the experience or just like build on it. So I'm hoping that more things happen, but I think when you're dealing with anything that abrasive, it's like, there's probably a limit to how many food safe things we can probably work with. So everybody be careful if you're experimenting with that at home.
Yeah. Well, I remember I was in a talk with Rafael Mir, who's on the the foundation of
Tortillas.
The Tortilla de Maíz Mexicana, and he mentioned that the Mayans, I think, had used seashells, and so that really made me go like, "Whoa! I want to nixtamalize with seashells." So, if anybody out there wants to do a science experiment with me sometime, I have a jar of my daughter's seashells that she collected this summer. Maybe I can try that someday.
You just you can do it. You're just calcifying like mussel shells, and there's all sorts of like bones. Those that can be used if they're calcified at a really high temperature. But I have not. It sounds like something that was done at Stone Barns, when I was there. But I was already long down the corn rabbit hole at that point.
Yeah. I think I probably just have time for one more question for you, and then we can get to the questions in the chat. But I guess I want you to, I'm curious if you could just speak on like, what is the magic for you? I think so many of us are, me included, but I feel like the people who are really into Masa, we're really into Masa, and there is this kind of magic to it. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about like where do you find the magic in all of this?
I think it starts with, it's sort of been like my journey with any food that I spend a little more time, this like one of the first experiences I had was, just like when you see how things are pickled, and it's like it as a consumer, especially, I'm a millennial, so just like growing up in like the conventional grocery stores, everything was really, and I grew up in Miami, which is like, I don't know if anyone's here from Miami, but like not the most self-sufficient. You don't have a lot of homesteaders in Miami, who are like, ready for the apocalypse. Like they could probably not fend for themselves. And my family included, we used to eat, like Goya and things out of a can. And I couldn't have told you what any of that looked like in a field. I couldn't have identified any of that, let alone grown it. And I think just starting to understand agriculture and that relationship with the food I was consuming, I was just really mesmerized by the process, how much time it took to make a bean, or corn. Like it just deepened my relationship with food in general and made me realize that this doesn't just happen. It's really a miracle that we can even eat, you know, and there's a whole system to support it. So I think Masa specifically, you know, you've got a raw ingredient, corn, that like literally needs human intervention to survive, and in a lot of ways has manipulated. Despite that relationship, it's still kind of like Michael Pollan would say that it runs us. You know, and I started to really see that in the process of just understanding it from a supply chain perspective. But Masa like really it's the culmination of two incredible inventions: corn and then nixtamalization. And like the amount of trial and error that went into doing that is like astounding, you know. And not only that, but like that it catalyzed an entire civilization, arguably one of the greatest civilizations of all time. Pretty unbelievable. It's like it's up there with the iPad, you know. So I think that in and of itself, when you contextualize its importance to like the world, our global, you know, larder, you know, our global palette, that's pretty impressive. But honestly, I mean, you mentioned what my company does. It sources corn. We also, you know, source all the tools, tortilla presses. They're not tchotchkes, you know what I mean? Like these have been really critical elements in my own journey to deepen the relationship with the food that I love. And when you do that process yourself, you just like, no taco is ever the same. No tamale is ever the same. Like the flavor is totally different, and you did it yourself. Like it's like that Betty Crocker moment, you know. It's probably the earliest memory I have of like cooking something from scratch, but not really cooking something from scratch, you know. Like it takes you somewhere that you couldn't have arrived without getting your hands dirty, you know. And I don't know, because it touches so many foods, I'm just like constantly astounded by how much pleasure I derive from it. And it's really cool to be able to control that.
Yeah. Well, that was lovely. I feel like we could keep talking, but I want to get to, there's several questions in the chat that I want to get to. So from Courtney, we have, could you speak to the relationships you have with the farmers in Mexico? How have those relationships developed over the years as you created this book and as the Masa revolution is happening now?
Yeah. So the farmers that we work with in Mexico, you know, we started working with about 12 farmers, and our network today, year over year, is about at a 2,000 folks that we work with across different, I think about 6 different states, many different regions within those states. Each of those regions and communities look really different from one another. They are all connected by the fact that they're subsistence farmers, so they produce corn for their household consumption. And the model that we have been basically building for the last 9 years is one that is basically offering a risk-free opportunity for farmers to just like get rid of any additional surplus inventory they have that they don't have a need for in their home, which historically was really hard for them to do because they're competing with commodity corn that's being dumped into the US. And so, you know, for us, the relationship has been, I think they were like really curious and kind of frankly, like, you know, not impressed in the beginning with what we were trying to do. And after 9 years, you develop a real sense of trust and partnership with the communities that we work in. It's just really great. It's great to offer that option. It's nothing more, nothing less. Like we don't have a savior complex about it. It's just like, it feels good. It tastes great. And, you know, I think it leaves the system and the tradition, you know, in a better state to see another day. You know, it's not an easy one to continue. There are a lot of odds against it. So that felt really important. And I think that how has it changed? You know, just more folks, more I think representation across the states that we care a lot about and the people that we want to serve. And just the consciousness and appreciation for the cultures that make it possible is like an amazing shift. You know, no one was thinking about Masa in this way, you know, from such a deep level. And frankly, the work had been done for decades before Masienda even started. There were farmers and scientists who'd been doing all of this hard preservation work. And we really were just sort of all, you know, I think we were a missing link, but we were one of many links that make the work possible.
Okay, from Rita, we have, she says she loves the Masienda Presents videos, and she says the masarina is delicious.
Mhm.
Do you source your
Thank you.
corn from a specific state?
It's 6 states, I think, right now. And the Masienda is fairly, I mean, it depends on the year, honestly, and what we have available. If we have to do, sub yellow bolita for yellow tuxpeño, we'll do that. But like, still get the recipe pretty close to what you would expect, so it feels consistent. I love Masienda Presents too. Really, really excited about that series. If you've not checked it out on YouTube, it's just a really beautiful sort of short film documentary series that our friend Daniel Klein and Mira Fine put together. They're now full-time with Masienda, which is great, but they're incredible storytellers, and you should check it out. Masienda YouTube.
All right. Cristina asks, maize, I was going to say maíz, but I could say maíz. Maíz is such a spiritual ceremonial plant in so many cultures. Was there ever a point on your Masa journey where you felt connected to that spirit?
Oh yeah, I think it like probably wrote the pages, more so than I did. I think there was something about it felt very, felt heavy in like a good way, like a really fitting responsibility to just make sure that I was doing right by thousands of years of history and, millions of hands that have touched it, billions probably. Yeah, it felt it. I think when I tell folks that I just feel like a vessel for this cause of this movement, this food, this culture, all of the cultures, like it really is that, like it was just sort of a way to help people connect to it at whatever level they're at. And it just felt like a service to the tradition, and the kind of the spirit that inhabits that. That sounds perhaps woo woo when I say it, but I genuinely feel that it was like I did not write this book. I feel like it was written by thousands, hundreds of thousands of people over a long period of time, and something connected that for sure.
All right. I know, Rita, you asked another question, but since you already asked one, I'm gonna ask from someone else. Gabriel wonders, are there any common mistakes you could point out and help us avoid when we start to nixtamalize and/or grind the corn?
Yeah, I think that, well, it depends on what your end goal is, but something to think about, because if you're grinding corn, sometimes, you might want a coarser grind or a finer grind, but assuming you're going to go for like a table tortilla masa, I think the biggest thing I see is, folks typically feel very unsure about how to cook it and how long to cook it. And it's really just like, cook it until it tastes good. It's like beans, it's like, how do you know? No one's ever like broken down the science. I mean, people have broken down the science, I guess, but like, you're probably not thinking about that because beans just feel like very approachable. Corn is the same. It's just a starch. Make it taste good. If it starts to taste like a tortilla, if it starts to kind of have like a nice little al dente, like Italian al dente, not like American al dente, like a little bit of extra bite to it, but still it's easy to break down, you're good. I think that's a common misconception about corn, and just seems like much more complicated. It's just like, make it taste good, you'll know. And I think the other thing is moisture. Typically Masa is like pretty thirsty, and people often complain about your tortilla pulp falling apart, or it gets really cracking. And there's a very technical test for this that I outline in the book called the Smush Test. And basically you get your masa once it's been ground, and there's a couple different ways outlined in the book to do that. But you take your masa, you roll it up into a ball, and then you smush it. And then if the edges of the masa that you've just smushed are cracking, it means your masa is a little thirsty. You should give it a little more water. But it really needs that water to kind of bind that entire kind of network structure of the masa, as I call it in the book. The moisture, really moisture. It's like every time someone emails us, we just usually start there. So just moisture is probably the answer.
I will chime in that I'm always so fearful, because once you add too much water, you sort of like can't go back. I guess you need to add a little masarina or something, but maybe I don't know, you address that in the book. But
you can also let it just dry out masa it will dry out very quickly. So like in tortillas, if they've done too much water when grind during the grinding process, they'll kind of just let it sit for half an hour before they start shooting it out. And they'll find that, and sometimes they'll even put like a fan on it. I've seen just like hasten it, hasten the drying out process. But I find most often it's very unusual that books add too much water to it.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, Perla says, the dreaded tortilla aisle is why we got into making our own nixtamal tortillas and eventually started our tortilleria in Seattle. All right, Perla, congrats. With regards to labeling, do you have any advice as to what we should look at to know which are real nixtamal tortillas, and maybe comment on shelf extenders?
Yeah, great question. I wonder what tortilleria Perla's writing from. Let us know. I think the biggest thing is that corn, water, and cal, or trace of lime is what you want to look for. If you can usually smell through the package. Even those three ingredients, like some folks can put a lot of cal in it because it's can prolong they sort of extend the shelf life. But I find that it really turns the flavor into something that it's too much of a good thing. It turns bad. It's like starts to taste a little bit like bile, which is, we don't have to talk about what that tastes like, but it's not very appetizing. So I think that even those three ingredients, that's typically the first giveaway. When you start to see a laundry list of stuff in there, typically acids is when that, you could just sort of avoid it. Also, if it's sitting ambient, on a shelf, it's most likely something that's going to be, unless you have like a really great local delivery system, it's hard to find something of quality that's sitting on a shelf for that long, because it's just not meant to. It's a really high quality tortilla that tastes good and built with a good foundation, should probably, unrefrigerated, probably won't last more than a day, maybe two. So yeah. Smell, if it smells really sour, probably don't want to mess with it. Or you can just know that it's not going to be the best version of itself that it might be able to be.
Mitchell, I hope I'm saying the name right, is asking, you sort of already touched on this, but wants to know what kinds of recipes are in the book.
Lots of recipes, Mitchell. We've got kind of the core recipes of how to make masa from scratch, which if you want to just skip that part and go straight to just using masa harina for all of the other recipes, there's like another 40-ish recipes from there. It covers all of that. So all of the masa shapes, once you have masa, you can use this book to confidently conquer all of the shapes that there are, or at least like the really important ones that we see across Mexico and beyond. You've got modern masa recipes, which are contributed from folks like Sean Brock, Jess Stevens, Carlos Salgado, Daniela Soto Inés, just like really, really creative talents that take masa and kind of turn it into really fun uses that we don't always think about when it comes to masa. So yeah, I think they're really complementary between tradition and kind of that modern's like a misnomer, but like, unconventional, we'll call it, masa applications that are really delicious. The masa tamal is like, the gnocchi tamal is like one of my favorite things. It's amazing.
The coffee atole also sounded absolutely amazing, and I wanted it right away.
Very good.
Do we have time for this last question, Zoe, the second one from Rita?
Sure, absolutely, go ahead.
So she wanted to know, Jorge, can you speak to the use of juniper ash for nixtamalizing?
Yeah, I mean, in definitely most like North America, Native American communities, that was one of the hardwoods that was used with juniper. And I have not used it myself, but I know that it is definitely something that you find throughout, I guess I can't remember exactly what regions, but certainly throughout North America, modern day United States, even up into Canada, I think. But traces of that have been found. I've never used it myself because I don't have a ready supply of juniper ash or juniper wood. But if you do it, let us know how it tastes. I'd love to try it.
Fantastic. I just wanted to jump in right here at the end and share. I don't know if my green screen will let you see it, but
oh, thank you.
These are the Masa harina waffles, which look absolutely amazing, and one of the ones I'm excited to try.
It's a really fun recipe. Jess Stevens nailed it with that one. She used to work at Empellón and Onda. She's just like a very creative thinking outside of the box with regards to Masa, and she killed it with that.
I love that. Well, thank you so much to both of you. This has been such a wonderful Masa conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening as well. And congratulations on such an amazing book, Jorge. We all are very excited.
Thanks so much, Zoe. Thank you, Lesley, for doing
Thanks,
this.
Jorge. Thank you,
Thank you,
Zoe.
everybody. Hope you enjoy the book.
Have a good night.
Right.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye,
y'all.
y'all.